Okay. Good morning to well, good morning, depending on where you are based. But hi everyone. My name is Xavier Rubio, and I'm part of the University of Barcelona. And I will talk today about this topic, the topic of exploring historical conflict with games. Okay, here is the slide. Thanks. So this is the topic I will be talking today, and I will be using to explore that what I call a modeling approach. What exactly does this mean? That's something that I want to contextualize now. So the idea here is that let me give you some personal background on why this link between models and games and what is actually my research. So here you can see some of the research I've been doing on the last years, and as you can see, I'm quite interested on conflict, particularly conflict archaeology, but in general war studies. And one of the methods I use to explore that is what I call computational approaches. So these computational approaches could be related on statistical analysis, the use of old cartography, like 18th century cartography, to recreate, on the top right, a siege of the 18th century. Then, oops. I don't know what. Okay, sorry. I don't have it with my screen. So visibility analysis for defenses of the Spanish Civil War. So here, what I mean is that I use computational models to explore conflict, but at the same time, I'm interested on the use of games to explain or explore the past. So here are a couple of examples of things I've been working. And the idea here is that I also use games to explore this heritage and present or communicate things that I feel are interesting to the main audience. So there are a third step here, relevant here, which is the idea that I play a lot of games. Here you can see particularly war games. I'm quite interested in that. So somehow on this mix of things, games for learning, games for fun, and also modeling of the past, I have in some ways a feeling that all of this resonate a lot for me, especially because these historical dynamics that are captured in commercial games, in war games, are in some aspects quite similar to my own work doing models of the past. So that is actually the topic of the talk, of the seminar. What I want to do here is to explore these connections between games and models, and particularly why a modeling approach to these games can help us better understand the past using actually the games, but also understand better the games and what they're trying to capture. So I will be talking first what I mean by a game, and then I will focus on three different aspects: playing games, creating games, and analyzing games. I will conclude my seminar with some final thoughts on this regard. So what exactly do I mean by a game? Because you may have a lot of different definitions of what a game is. To me, a game is a model. A model is or can be defined as a representation of reality that you define to actually understand reality. Okay, and this model can be very different things. It could be a set of equations, such as the Newtonian's laws for gravity. It could be a map, which is also a type of model of reality. It could be some kind of diagram. It could even be. It doesn't need to be formal. It could be, for example, the definition of how society works that Karl Marx did. This is actually a model of how society works, and as a consequence, all of these models, they capture some part of it because it's interesting for the creator of the model, but it leaves a lot of things out of it. Okay, because to study reality, what you actually need to do is to limit the object of the study. You have a question, you have a hypothesis, then you define the model to answer this question, to explore that, and you leave out of it most of reality, actually, because it's or you consider it irrelevant for your question. I think that the map is one of the most obvious metaphors of this, because in a map, which is a model, obviously you don't put everything out there, okay? Otherwise, the map would be useless. So the map has some components that the creator thinks can be useful to understand this reality. And for example, if you create a map of a military engagement, such as the one here at the bottom right, that you will create some simplifications of this reality. For example, you may be using blocks instead of drawing every single human that participated in the battle. You choose a specific time to show the deployment, and you add some signals to communicate, such as, for example, the scale, or, for example, arrows where showing where the people is actually moving. Okay. What's the difference between all these models and a game? Well, the main goal of the game is rather different than all of these things, because the main goal is to entertain. To entertain doesn't mean to be fun. That's very important. To entertain just means that people will engage with the game, and they will be focused on the game, and they will be trying to solve the challenges that the game poses to them. Okay. So this is not actually new, because there is a whole branch of mathematics and mathematical models called game theory that is focused on modeling social behavior. These really are not games in the sense that we are thinking, or I'm thinking right now, because they are really boring, because you don't have any kind of interaction. The idea of game theory is that it allows you to model social behavior and, for example, define interesting bits of it, such as how cooperation emerges. So here you have the famous prisoner's dilemma, and in this dilemma, what this dilemma explores is this idea that if you have two people that, if they cooperate, they will, let's say, they will reach an optimal solution. But if one of them do not cooperate, this person will actually have a better output of the game, then they will tend to avoid cooperation. And as a consequence, it's kind of a trap, because the problem is that, or the dilemma here is that we know that cooperation exists. However, in the simplest of the scenarios, such as the prisoner's dilemma, it's very hard to find this cooperation. So the question is, how exactly cooperation emerges from this situation? So it's just a toy example of how a model of this kind can help you understand social dynamics, okay? Beyond this idea, and as I said, I repeat, this is not a game as a proper game, as something to have fun with. A game under game theory is defined by 4 different things. And this is something that I actually think it applies quite well to any kind of game. So what you have are players, then you have a set of rules, a set of actions that the players can take under these rules, and then a set of outcomes. So the idea is that the players will try, within the boundaries of the rules, will try to use actions to maximize their outcome, okay? So that these 4 elements are, I would say, quite useful to contextualize what we feel as a game. If we talk about historical games, then, well, you can define them as models of the past, or at least part of the past, that are created to engage people with this past, okay? And this can be done in very different things. It could be an exploration of the past, like the ruins of the past, as you can see in video games such as, I don't know, Tomb Raider or Uncharted. Then you may have a historical setting as let's say, the background of the game. You may be modeling a historical event, such as most wargames, or you just may have a historical theme, like using the artistic style of one specific period, but without really going deep into what this period is. So just to show you some examples of how you can actually use these 4 components, player, rules, actions, and outcomes, to define any of these models. Here you have one very famous video game, Battlefield 5. This is a first-person shooter, and what you have here is a historical setting. So it's not trying really to reproduce a historical event, but what he's trying to do, or it's trying to do, is to show to the players one context that may resonate with some ideas of the past. Then you have historical games in the sense that they have a theme, but they are not really about history. So the idea here is that history is a free franchise that you can use to add some flavor to your game. And it's a franchise that is free because you don't have to pay for it as you would need to do if, I don't know, you want to add superheroes from Marvel's universe. Okay, so the idea here is that everybody knows what the pyramid of Egypt are. So you can actually create a game with the pyramids of Egypt, and everybody will know that. And also, this gives you a sense of a theme that can be used, for example, at the level of the artwork. Okay, so this is what most Eurogames are about. And then again, you can define this idea of you have 3-4 players, you have a bunch of very simple actions to do, and you have rules about, for example, the turn sequence or what happens when you roll a 7, and then you have a very explicit outcome, which in this case would be the victory point. So the first one that reaches to X victory points then is the one that will win. Okay, and then you have war games that usually they tend to model a historical event, and in this case, let's say that they tend to be more complex, but they are still under the same. They work with the same framework. So you may have, for example, a lot of detail on combat dynamics, on how units interact with each other, on the environment, the terrain, the landscape. But then other things are just not there because it's a model, right? So maybe you would only model, I don't know, the tides on the first day of the D-Day landings, but after that, you just ignore that and you are not really interested in this. Or you can model some geographical features that you feel are relevant for combat, but ignore other ones that are not, okay? So, I don't know, you are not modeling how soldiers will find water, for just saying one thing, because you are not that interested in logistics or interested in other things. Still, you have the same 1-2 players, then you have rules like how do you plan your invasion of the beaches, how do you move, how do you combat, etc. And a set of actions to move or strengthen your forces in order to achieve the outcomes that they tend to be, again, in a war game, victory points. They tend to be, because there are other war games that work in a different way, but usually most of the war games work as they define victory as a combination of geographical control and the defeat of enemies. As I said, usually, because you always have exceptions. So that's the idea, and all games work like that, even if you are not that interested in one thing or the other one. For example, lots of war games are played just because you enjoy learning the rules, you enjoy using the actions, and also because you really enjoy understanding what was going on in this historical event. Not really because you want to win or lose, because that is something that may be secondary depending on the games. Otherwise, I mean, imagine that you play one of these war games that is like, I don't know, 40 hours of play, and everything is about who wins and who loses, just as it happens in Catan. That or chess, right? That would be terrible because you just wasted 40 years of your life, and that's probably not the best idea. So, okay, so if these are historical games, one thing that I ask myself as a researcher, as a gamer, is what can I do with that? Okay, in the sense that games are not models that are actually designed to model the past, in the sense that I do when I create simulations of, I don't know, 18th century tactics or Roman legions, okay? That's not the case, because they are created to be entertaining and to engage, right? So that's something that you always have to think about. And also, there are issues that may not be still super useful if you want to improve your understanding of military history or just historical dynamics. Things like over everything, you always promote competition because it's fun. Okay, so it's hard to see, for example, a war game where you can actually negotiate peace and stop the war, because actually the fun is about or the engagement is about the war and using military units to defeat the enemy. Also about the balance. Obviously, you need something where everybody can win, some more or less. So from this perspective, as an author, you will probably change this balance to suit your interests. And overall, what you need is a high level of engagement. One classical example is about micromanagement. The level of control that you have when you are controlling an army in in a majority of wargame is much higher than than the actual commanders had, right? So usually, or at least until 20th century, most of the battles, the commander, the only thing that that the commander can do after the battle begins is to send reserve. But if that's the only decision that you have in a war game, that could be quite boring. So we micromanage everything because it's much more entertaining. Okay. However, there are some interesting bits here that I want to focus. One of them is that they are still models of the past. Okay. So that's something very useful because it means that you can actually explore this past through the models. Some of the models will be very, if you want to call it scientific or scientific focus. Some other ones will be much more entertaining, but they are still models and we can do something with this. Second of it is that some designers seek very strong detail on these historical simulations, meaning that maybe, or at least that's what the authors would like to think, you can actually better understand the past or the military tactics of the past using these games, okay? And finally, one interesting bit is that anyone can create games. So if you don't like how, I don't know, the Roman legions are modeled in war games, you can actually create a war game that fits or that fits your vision of what combat in Roman times was. So the idea is that if a game is a model, then you can explore that in 3 different ways. First of all, if you play games, you will experiment the past. And by experimenting the past, you can actually learn things about it. Second, you can create a game. You can create your own model of the past. And finally, and I think it's a very, let's say, original approach to that because it's not quite typical on war games, is that you can analyze the present by exploring the war games that the present people create, meaning that any cultural product of a society is a reflection of this society, is part of this society. So if you study these war games, you will better understand, for example, what is the military approaches to conflict, even if it's like Roman conflict or medieval conflict, better than if you explore, let's say, a war game that was created in the 70s. They are different approaches, different visions, and you should be able to identify these differences, thus understanding better the whole idea of war studies. Okay, so let's explore these 3 things, okay? Playing, creating, and analyzing. Let's start with playing and what this can provide to us as players. So the first idea is that the game, because it's a model, right? So the game allows you to explore or experience the past. But what you are actually experiencing is the perspective of the designer. So you are not really time traveling to the past. What you are experiencing is this idea that you can actually explore the past or the perspective of the designers. What is the goal of your study, research? So the goal of my study is to understand how games can help me understand the past. And actually, the other thing is how games can help me understand the present relation to the past, understanding past as heritage. So if we can, let's say that to me, a game is a learning tool that can be used to explore the past in 3 different things. One of them is playing games to experience this past. Second, creating games as models. And third, analyzing the idea of game as a cultural construct. Okay, I hope that makes more or less sense. It's quite exploratory. I accept that. On games are models designed to entertain. Do you mean hobby games? Some games are designed for academic or analytic purposes, in my understanding. Yes, I'm talking here about. Probably I should have been more specific on that. I'm referring here to games that are commercial war games. Okay. And I agree that there are other types of games. Actually, when we talk about creating games, that's something that we will be talking about. That other people or other scholars actually have selected this idea of games as model and then go forward with that and do something that could help them in terms of research, let's say pure research on the past. So the idea is that because games want to allow you to experience this past, they will emphasize some specific aspects of it, okay? And I will talk here about three different things that I feel that are very interesting in my case, as a scholar interested on military history. Three things that are very useful to me when I'm playing games, and it somehow that makes me I feel like a better scholar just because they give me different experiences of this past. One is the idea of the setting. Okay. Obviously, when you are playing one of these commercial games or war games, have you read Sabine's Lost Battles? Yes, I will talk about that later. Yeah, it's exactly that. That's Sabine's idea of creating models of the past. It's exactly one of the main strong points of creating war games. But probably in a different approach that Philip Sabin talks about, but we'll talk about it later. So the idea of the setting, as I was saying, is that okay, I'm mostly focused on some specific topics, such as I said, war studies or things like that. However, because I'm curious about history, and also I like to compare what I know with what I don't know, and maybe learn from other things, playing games allows you to have, like, let's say, an introductory approach to these topics. For example, this case, Watergate, I think it's a very interesting case of, it's in this case, a board game where what you do is you actually model the whole Watergate case based on a very simple mechanics. But it allows me, for example, to start understanding what was going on, what type of persons were involved on that, and also what type of actions did the different sides in order to fulfill their objectives, okay? So from this perspective, a game, just even if you are not that interested on the topic, even if it's not your topic of study, allows you to have a deeper understanding of historical dynamics just because you know more things. You could also do that with, obviously, a book or I don't know, a TV show, but by playing it, you have a deeper understanding of, for example, the social dynamics, the interaction between the different components, that if you would do that with a book. Then you have the constraints and challenges, and that's something that I enjoy very much when I play war games. The idea here is that time provides this perspective that allows you to say, for example, oh, Hannibal was wrong because he should have besieged Rome after defeating the Roman legions. Of in Waterloo, Napoleon did this mistake, this other one, he was too lazy, and he should have taken Hugomon before whatever. So that is quite typical in military history, because military history sometimes is too, I would say, too judgmental. Instead of understanding what's going on, sometimes it feels like you are judging the commanders because you are actually assessing what they did right and what they did wrong. Okay, so from this perspective, again, allows you to have this perspective. Say, okay, so if you feel it's so easy, then try it yourself. Try to take Hugomon yourself in the Battle of Waterloo. It's somehow this idea that everybody in the audience is complaining against a player in sports like football or soccer that failed a penalty. But the idea is, yeah, but did you try to score one? It's not that simple, okay? So things like, I think one of the most interesting cases on this is the First World War in the Western Front. This idea that we have that this idea of the futile offensive, where commanders are throwing or wasting the life of thousands of soldiers trying to do something that it's impossible, which is to break the front of the enemy. That's something that it's very much well captured by games like Somme 1918 from Exasim, where when you are pushing the offensive, at some point, instead of stopping, you still think that you will be lucky, you will get lucky, and you will break this front. Okay, it usually doesn't happen, but this feeling that the next one is the good one, that's something that as a player you feel, and it's obviously it's not the same, but it allows you to better understand why in some contexts commanders would always try to push again and again, even if it's obvious, when you have the perspective of time, even if it's obvious that it's gonna fail, okay? And then the other thing that it's interesting is the idea of the alternative. Because again, compared to other products that allows you to learn about the past, such as books, a game is not narrative. And it can give you enough freedom to explore alternative paths of history, such as, for example, why would happen. What would happen if the Allied would land in Calais instead of Normandy? Okay, this is a good example of that. Is the Liberty Roads game from the same company, Exasim, where it's like a large scale approach to the Allied offensive on Western Europe, and you can choose to land in any place from around the entire coast. So you could actually try to land in Le Havre instead of Normandy. Good luck with that, because that would mean, for example, that yes, you have less German army then, but then the issue is that your planes will not be able to give air support to your troops. So you'll see what will happen. But at least it allows you to explore that. And obviously, maybe Le Havre is an extreme, but you could do that in other areas, which is that were actually seriously considered to be the focus of Allied activities such as Calais, or other ideas such as what should I prioritize, Patton or Montgomery? So all these topics that are very recurrent, and you will see a lot of discussion about these ideas. This is something that actually games allows you to try and see if the possible solutions work or not. And this is actually quite linked to the work of Philip Sabin, and this idea that okay, obviously it's not a game will never give you the exact final answer, but it allows you to use explorative approach to history that we are not really used to, and that could work quite well as somehow a virtual lab. So we are not physicists, we don't have labs, but this is the closest thing to a lab. You can define your experiment and try to see how it works, okay? The extreme of that is what is called the sandbox approach. So this tends to be more linked to grand strategy games, and in these games, what you may have is this idea that you can do anything that you want to. So what would happen if, I don't know, Italy remains neutral in World War II? Or what would happen if you try to, I don't know, resist the Christian kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula, etc. Okay, so this is the extreme of that, and obviously here you have a balance between two things. One of them is the idea that you want to feel historical, but on the other hand, historical does not mean that it needs to follow exactly what happens. So you can give the player enough freedom, or at least enough sense of freedom, so this person can try to do things. And then the narrative, the power of these games is precisely on this idea that you can create your own objectives, your own outcomes if you want to, and then go for them if you want to try, okay? And then the other thing, and I would say this is probably more about video games than games, is what's called, than war games, this sense of agency. Because becoming a character provides a very powerful approach to the past that it's very difficult to media. As an example, in games, it's probably one of the few media where you're always talking first person. So I played, I invaded, whatever, I defeated someone. So you don't do that in a movie, right? In a movie, you don't use first person. So that's something quite interesting, because this level of agency of you are the commander, that's something that can be used. One issue though is that it gives you a very biased version. The games tend to give you a very biased version of history, because usually you are a powerful character. You are a commander instead of a soldier. You are a knight instead of a peasant. You're a soldier instead of a civilian, right? This is something that is changing slowly, at least in video games. And here you see some examples of that. This War of Mine or A Plague Tale. These are games where you are not playing powerful characters, and this gives you a completely different sense of the historical background that if you are playing with the king of the region. Okay, so that's something that I would say is very biased, but it's slightly improving. Otherwise, the problem is that you will always perceive history or the past as a powerful character, and that's something that, I mean, most people would not have this level of power. It's part of the interest in games, because it's usually power that you don't have in reality. But on the other hand, the experience by itself is very much limited. Then you have other games that are providing this sense of agency. One of the most interesting to me is Target for Today, or this one example of this string of war games, usually solitary war games, where let's say that the actions that you may take are very, very limited, because what they want to provide is a rich narrative of some context. And because you don't have that many actions, as a consequence, you also have this sense of agency of not being super powerful. Here, usually, you tend to die, let's say, or explode, or your world will explode before you finish. And there are other similar games on U-boats, for example, such as the Hunters, or similar experiences where you don't play it for the actions, even the outcomes. You play it for the narrative that they provide, and this depth or this immersion that you can have while playing it. Okay, and some players will complain, yeah, but it's boring because you don't really do anything. But the idea is that just by rolling some dice and reading some text, you have a stronger immersion that if you do that in any other with any other mechanic. So this is about playing games. As I said, this idea of agency, but also of exploring alternate historical dynamics, also this idea of trying something to see if it will work, that's something that is very useful as a player. But creating games gives you a deeper approach to this, particularly because usually you are interested in one conflict or one battle or one event, and you want to create a game. If you do that, then what you aim to do is to create a good model of this battle, right? But then you start asking a lot of questions about it, asking yourself lots of questions, such as, what is the goal of the game? What is the outcome? Because it's a model, you have to define your boundaries, right? So what exactly should be taken into account in the game? What should I leave outside of the game because I'm not interested, or it's not relevant for my vision of this event, right? So these are all the things that you ask yourself, and also what is the level of engagement of the players, and then you go to more details, such as if it's a competition or it's about cooperation, if it's artwork, what type of artwork will you have? Will you use, for example, standard NATO counters? Will you use something different because, I don't know, it's medieval times and that doesn't really work quite well? And another obvious choice is, what is the level of complexity that you want to give to the rules and the models that you create, right? So just as an example of this process, I was interested on creating a war game about one specific battle that I have been researching in the past, which is an assault to a city in 18th century Europe, in this case, the city of Barcelona, by a combined Spanish and French army. So I had to ask myself lots of questions that, as a scholar, I never asked myself. Things like, okay, what is the size of, a regiment deployed within a city? Okay, how do they actually fight? Because we may have a better understanding of a battle in let's say, outside the city, but inside the city, things get very confusing. If you work with written sources, things will get really confusing. You may have a bunch of maps, people talking about it, but it doesn't give you a homogeneous or coherent perspective on the engagement. So from this perspective, if you create the game, you need to solve all these issues, because the game will have to be coherent. You finally have to write a bunch of rules, and these rules will need to reflect or to develop the narrative as your model is intended to do that. So that is an issue that needs to be dealt with. And then you ask yourself questions such as I was saying, what if the battle was not balanced? This one was not, because you have an army of around, I don't know, maybe 40,000 soldiers against 5,000. So from this perspective, in this case, for example, I created a game where the outcome is not about who wins the battle. The defenders cannot win. What you will have is a comparison between what happens in reality and the outcome of the game, and then based on that, you will say what player is the winner. But then other things such as what is the level of the unit of analysis. In this case, we decided to go for companies because regiments was too small. Companies seemed okay, but then as you can see here in the image, you have a huge number of French, Spanish troops. But that's how it was. So it gives you an interesting perspective also on the balance of forces here between the two sides. And then also things like this idea of what do you want to do with the historical events? Do you want the players to replicate everything? Here we decided to go for that. So, for example, the French-Spanish player cannot assault through any other region of the city. They have to assault on the place that was actually used for the assault, but then it allowed us to create a more detailed map of the region. So it's about urban fighting instead of choosing the proper place to do the assault, which is, I guess, a different game. Okay, so that is interesting. But then once, imagine that you test that, you develop that, you write the rules, etc., and then you publish the game. And then what you find is a final thing that, again, you may find if you write popular history books. But in this case, it's much more different because the community of wargamers and board gamers can be much more direct in the sense that it's a smaller community. So you have things like what you could see in board game Geek, where some people, such as this nice comment at the end, was a thorough review, and then you may agree or not, but at least this player gives you reasons why it's a good or a bad game, or what did they enjoy of the game, and that is an interesting interaction between when as a creator, what you want to communicate to the player and what the player got from it. But then you have other things, like someone saying it's a crappy game, and then it rates with a 1 with no other explanation, or other interesting bits, such as the ones on top. So the story behind this is that this battle is quite famous here in Catalonia, in Barcelona, because it's kind of a historical myth. In a fight between, it's quite long to explain, but let's say it's a historical myth about the struggle between Catalonia and Spain. Okay, it's not exact. In reality, it's not that, but it's a myth, so part of it is not. It's not true. Anyway, so you have these comments here from Spanish users criticizing the game because they said that, for example, it was paid by the Catalan government, which was not the case. That's not the idea, or that it's science fiction, not history. And that's something quite interesting to see, because, I mean, it's like, okay, I have been researching this war for 10 years, but fine, it did not exist. So that's something that when you create a game, you also have to accept. People will review the game, people will play the game, and then you will have a lot of feedback from this, okay? As a scholar, again, okay, you are used to reviews, but the reviews usually are from other scholars, so it's not exactly the same thing. It's a different type of audience, and you have to engage, I guess, in quite a different approach. This is another example of a game I created, nothing to do with war games, but it's a different idea that I feel it's quite interesting. It's the idea that you can create games to, let's say, be used as an educational tool in a more explicit way than the previous game. So the idea here is that we got Foundation gave us a budget to create a game on a very important archaeological site related to Neanderthals, which is called Atapuerca, and other species important on the hominid evolution. So the idea here, which is quite interesting, is that, or at least that's what we thought, is that instead of only being about entertainment, what you could do is you could introduce educational mechanics within this game. Where could someone obtain a copy of this game? I guess that you talk about the previous one. I'm not sure, because the company that published it, it was actually the only game they published, and then they somehow disappeared. We never got sent from the game. It was, I think it was quite a shame. So I'm not sure if it's, I guess that some people probably still sell it secondhand, but I'm not really sure that you can buy it in in a shop, unfortunately. This other one is free, so you can actually download it from the Play Store or so Apple Store or Google Play if you want to. So in this case, the idea is, okay, let's pick everything that we know about the evolution of humans and let's introduce it in a game in a way that because as I said, in a game you have actions, rules, and outcomes. So let's force the player to learn things if they want to achieve their outcomes, okay? That's the idea. So instead of only being about entertaining, the idea is because every game, every single game is a learning process, you need to learn the rules and you need to learn the actions and how the actions interact with each other in order to achieve your outcome, your desired outcome, otherwise you will fail, then this is actually a very powerful learning mechanism. So in this case, I think it's an interesting bit, even if it's not a wargame for a simple reason. The game was created from scratch to be used as an educational tool. And in this case, it was about high school students, but I can easily imagine how you can do exactly the same with other products. And as some of you already pointed out, there are games that are war games designed for that. But my feeling is that it could be much more combined between commercial war games and professional war games. Okay, and usually war games do not tend to show this because they are very much focused on replicating the past in a much detailed world. But at least here, for example, the conflict is not really being taught at high school level or even university level. So war studies are very, at least in Spain, because of, let's say, historical reasons, are not well understood, and you don't have a lot of people working on that. So maybe one option would be to use this kind of approach to create war games that are accessible to everybody and that allow players to learn more about the past, at least in terms of here war studies, than other types of media, which are much more, let's say, much less interactive, such as a book. And then on this, one thing that I think is also worth emphasizing, and I will come to this later, is this idea that instead of basing your game in stereotypes and things like, I don't know, hunters were males and gatherers were females in this type of societies, things that you don't really have evidence about, you may be able to use the most interesting bits of current research and integrate that to make the game more compelling. Okay, here are some examples of that, like the type of animals that you can hunt are exactly the ones that you find in the archaeological record, but there are other things such as using, like the artwork may use the information we know or what the evidence we have about how these species actually dressed, and things like they have personal decoration, they have tattoos, they had language, right? So all of these things can be introduced in a game in a very straightforward manner. If you do that in a different, like in a book, it maybe you have to explain everything, right? In a game, you can use artwork for that. And in a video game especially, you can work on from this perspective. So you don't need to explain everything. Lots of things can be integrated in the mechanics, and that would allow you to integrate education, let's say, or educational resources in a much straightforward way in games than you usually see in educational games that are often tagged as boring just because they have a lot of text or, let's say, technical details, but they are not really using this kind of mechanics to explore what you can achieve. So the other thing is, or the final thing is this idea that when you design this game, you learn a lot. And as I said, you have to prioritize things because you are creating a model. And you ask questions to yourself that you never did before, I don't know, excavating a battlefield, okay? So this is what in engineering is called the rubber duck debugging approach. The idea that when you have a problem, in this case, in your code, and you don't really understand what's going on, what is failing, you can explain your problem to a rubber duck that you have in your desk. And the idea here is that because you are creating a discourse on what's wrong, you will improve your understanding of the situation. So just by telling the rubber duck what's wrong with your code, you will understand that, and then you will be able to fix that, okay? In a parallel manner, if a historian creates a game about a battle, will, for example, be able to test different hypotheses about, I don't know, the Roman tactics. That's what actually Philip Sabin did in his work, and understand if some of them make sense or they do not make sense. Okay, so that's something quite powerful, and what it suggests is that by creating games, you will explore approaches to the past that you are not used to, even if you are an expert on the topic. And as a consequence, probably games and war games in particular, because they are, I would say, easier to model, or at least there is a stronger tradition on creating models of historical conflict, would allow scholars to better understand their topic. Okay. So the last bit, as I said, is about analyzing games, and games as what's called games as cultural studies. So the idea here is that it's not about playing games. It's not about, but obviously you should play games to understand what you are doing, I guess. It's not about creating games, but it's this idea that a game is a cultural product from some society, from some authors, and then you may be able to study, using these games, the representation of the past that are used by a given society, okay? And that's something that has been growing in time, and actually in video games, there is right now a lot of people doing this kind of analysis. It's not that strong, I would say, in board games, but that's something that we can actually do. Here's I think an interesting graph about this figure shows the number of games published in the last 50 years in different, let's say, with different genres. Okay, this information is this data comes from Board Game Geek. So as you can see here, historical games are the most popular, and that is quite a feat, I would say, because then you have some fads, I guess, like zombies that were in fashion at some point. Sci-fi is always a very interesting theme. Probably fantasy right now is very much important because of Game of Thrones, I guess, because you have this huge increase by the 2010s. But historical games are always the most popular ones. So we have to realize about that. Like most of the time when people is playing games, they are playing historical themes. They are learning about history using these games, learning or at least trying to learn, or without knowing, learning interesting bits about it in the different ways I have been talking during the past slides. So that's something that we have to understand. And if you see the numbers, like every year right now we have, like every day you have 2-3 games with a historical setting that are being released. Your historical wargame is for students to study history. Do you modify if you get good counterfactual questions from them? If your students are also able to do so by themselves, do you let them? I have never used that wargame in the classroom. I would love to, but I have not done that. I have not done that because, as I said, I published that when I was a PhD student. So at that time, I didn't have students. So neither have. I'm preparing a new project doing precisely that for Spanish Civil War. So in this case, what we are going to do is we are going to develop the game, co-creating it with history and teacher education students, and exploring different ways that you can learn about the Spanish Civil War with them. Okay, so that's actually something that I'm really interested in trying, and see how this feedback between the creator of the game and players interested in the games can actually create a much more interesting game. We'll see. Maybe not, but at least that's the approach I took with the video games, with this game on Atapuerca, when we had like a playing version called, an alpha version. We have some testing sessions with high school students in Edinburgh. And for example, we realized that at this particular time, we didn't have a mini game on hunting, and every single student wanted to hunt mammoths and horses. Okay, so we realized that if we want to make the game entertaining, people have certain expectations, and a game about, in this case, Ice Age, needs to have some kind of interesting mechanic related to hunting. So we implemented that based on this feedback. I feel that in wargames, because I'm not sure if it's because of the size of the community, but in commercial wargames, testing is not really, so there is some testing, but it mostly focuses on some specific things. So you often play games that are not thoroughly tested, or let's say the final part of the game or the end game is not really well developed. So I feel that there is a lot of things that can be done to improve war games, based on adding testing and adding other people in the development process. But yeah, I think that that is an excellent approach that should at least that's what I'm going to try in the next years. So if we talk about games as historical game studies, then there is something that we have to think about, which is this idea that you are talking about a model of the past created in the present. So as a consequence, you will engage in some debates that go way beyond what the game is trying to do. Why? Well, because it's a model, right? So you define, as I said, you define your boundaries and you decide what you put in and when you put out. And this usually comes from an understanding of history by the designers, okay? This vision is one vision because we don't have like the truth of what happened in history. We have a lot of archaeological and written records, and then we build the past based on that. And every period emphasizes some things about the past. And this is obviously linked to political debates, right? So for example, here you have a case. It's not a war game, but I think it's an interesting game. Kingdom Come Deliverance is a game created by a Czech, if I'm not mistaken, a Czech publisher, developer that wanted to create an ultra-realistic and detailed approach to a 15th century Prague, okay? And what happened here is that they did not, well, actually everyone is white in this game, and this is what the author said. He said something like, because everybody was white, and then lots of historians said that's actually wrong because you have slaves and you have other people, traders, etc. And there's a huge debate on that. And I think one interesting bit was that some people defending the author, and actually the author of the game, said something like, because these people is trying to use history for politics. If you say that, it means, or it seems that you think that your vision of history is the truth, and then people are trying to change that. However, that's not true because you are using knowledge from other historians who actually had other political views. So what you have here is, because any game is a model, and you choose what you put inside and when you put outside, what type of information you want to use and what type of information you don't feel it's relevant, you always make a lot of choices, and these choices will be scrutinized by your players and it may be criticized. Okay, this is a very extreme case. Sorry. Okay, so this is an example of the type of comments this post had. You have this link here in Eurogamer, and as I said, it's a very complex discussion. I don't want to give my opinion on that. I'm just saying that if we understand any kind of game, or actually any kind of representation of the past as a model, then I think it's much better in the sense that nobody has the truth. Different models, obviously there are models that are more plausible than other ones, because if your model, I don't know, have tanks in Roman legion, that's actually a crappy model, but it is still a model. Anyway, it's not really historical, right? But apart from these extremes, if we understand that, I think that our approach to the game will be much more interesting, because we can explore what are the decisions of the creators and why exactly did they do one thing or the other one. So that's something that I feel is interesting. Related to that, you can, I was talking here about one specific game, but you can also do that at a larger scale. And one amazing resource that we have, if at least I'm interested in commercial war games or historical games, is Board Game Geek. This is an amazing resource because the data is open. So you can actually use this data to better understand what is going on with, let's say, with the wargaming scene in these years. So this is an example. Probably lots of you already know this website, but you have for each game or a large majority of games published in the last 50 years, you have information about, apart from the ratings, you have things about who owns the game, so how many people own the game, what category does it have, what is the historical period, the region, etc., etc. Okay, and you have this text, and you have comments, you have ratings, so you have a lot of information about two things: the game itself and the people playing the game. Okay. So, for example, one research I did recently, or I'm working on this right now, is this idea of what are the most interesting topics for wargame designers. Specifically, I focus on Europe, and the idea here is that I wanted to test if the topics that are used or are seen in wargames from different years have similar topics, so they are the same, or these topics change over time. Okay, so how did I do that? The idea is that I took all this information, I created a database, and I analyzed the database. For example, in this case, based on region, you can see here how a large majority of war games with a European coverage are mostly based in 3 regions. One is UK. The second is Normandy, or Normandy/the Ardennes, which is obviously for the large amount of World War II games focus on the North American war effort. And then you have other regions that you can see here in the whole map, right? That it's like, okay, what exactly is like? What do you have this kind of battles very represent, or regions that are very represented in this data set? This is usually they tend to be regions with a lot of Napoleonic battles. This is why the southern Spain has a lot of these games. But then you can also explore that from a temporal perspective, right? And this is the temporal coverage of all these games. What you can see here is that until Napoleonic Wars, you have a very low number of games covering all these periods. Yes, you have games, but because they are covering a huge amount of time, let's say the specific battles and wars, except for some exceptions such as Hastings in 1066, you don't have a lot of games covering that. In contrast with that, Napoleonic Wars, American Civil War, and particularly the 2 World Wars have a huge amount of interest as seen here. Okay, so that's something that is quite interesting in the sense that it allows us to understand how this let's say the wargaming as scene is understanding the past, or at least what is the interest in the past. Someone asked if there is a copy of the database of Wargame Geek available for analysis. Yes, there is a copy. And then the other thing is that this study, well, it's submitted, so it's not published yet. But once it's published, I will also upload the database. So anyone that wants to explore that will be able to do that. Because what I did is I got a subset of the entire data set, okay? But if you're interested, Wargame Geek has an application programming interface, an API, and you can Google that. You will find the link, and then here they give you some information about how can you actually get the data from that. One interesting but massive data that I have not used but should be quite interesting to explore is the log of plays. So you have thousands of plays that can be used to understand who is playing what game when. And for example, the only thing I did is I got all the plays for Catan to check how the COVID-19 pandemic affected the play of games. And it is amazing because once the pandemic starts, maybe the number of plays of Catan every day multiplies by, I don't know, 50, 100. So that's something that is quite explicit in this kind of data. I would say it's an amazing database in the sense that you don't have this kind of information for other types of cultural products. You don't have that for video games. You have some stuff, but not as open and rich as Wargame Geek. Even for movies, you have things like IMDb, but it's not the same. I would say that this is much better because of the richness of the information that you can get from that. So we have seen this idea that if we understand games as models of the past, then we can explore that in 3 different ways. We can play games and learn from the past by playing these games, provided that we understand that these games are created by one designer. Then if we create the games ourselves, we will understand a lot about historical dynamics and topics that we are supposed to have a deep knowledge on that, and you will realize that in the end, you know nothing about so many things. Even if you are an expert and have been working on that for 10 years, you will realize that lots of things that you feel are trivial, once you think about that and try to, for example, fit units in a map, you will realize that it doesn't make any sense. So that's something that worth trying. And then you can analyze this idea of games as cultural constructs, and from this perspective, understand how people feel or see about the past. So let me talk about some challenges of this kind of approach. And I will talk here 3 different things. One is the idea of the sensitive topics, then the stereotypes, and the biased grand narratives. So first thing is about one thing I feel, I'm not really sure if it's positive or negative, but the idea is that because competition is an interesting game mechanic, and conflict and, for example, colonialism are essentially competitions, they generate interesting game mechanics. That could be fine, but the problem is because games tend to be abstract. Some of the things that are a consequence of that are never represented in games, okay? I'm showing here an example of chess because chess is the most abstract game. And when people play chess, they don't realize they are playing a battle and that somehow soldiers are dying there, right? Because it's so abstract that you don't even bother about it. That's the same thing with a war game. You are usually, when you have losses, you flip a counter, that's fine. You don't think that means that 2,000 people were killed there. And that, I think it's a problem because it's a limitation at least, because that means that you will learn a heavily biased version of conflict that is quite clean, and then some essential social mechanisms are not there, such as war crimes, slavery, or genocide. I played a lot of war games, commercial war games. I think I never played a World War II war game where I used forced labor, such as what the Nazi Germany did, and they used millions of prisoners as forced labor. That's something that you don't see. So that's it's probably a bad thing as a educational tool. On the other hand, the issue here is that because we, as culturally speaking, we understand a game as something fun. So I don't think I would like to play a game where I actually have to commit war crimes. And now I have seen some unique games trying to do these kind of things, but it's something that until now has never been there, especially for war games that are touching obviously very sensitive topics. A simplest idea is that in most games, you don't have wounded, and you don't have to deal with the bodies of the soldiers that were killed in the battle. And that, as I said, that feels that at some point that makes sense, obviously, and it's an abstract, and the fun is to play it and win the battle. But on the other hand, if we want to take this more reflexive approach about playing, that's something that needs to be somehow integrated. Or not. I mean, that is my feeling. But obviously, if you have different opinions, I would love to discuss that now or after the talk. One example of that was this game that was submitted for P500 in GMT. That was about this colonial, the colonial race, if you want to call it that, for Africa. And once the game was in the GMT, which is one of the big wargame publishers right now, there was a lot of discussion about that and about the fact that because there was a lot of criticism, finally the game was retired from the publisher. Okay, and it is one of the issues is because the game was portraying, let's say, a very 19th century approach to colonialism, which makes sense as a game, but again, we cannot think of games as neutral products. They are never neutral, right? So let's say that again, as in the case of Kingdom Come Deliverance, I don't want to give my opinion, but on the one hand, I can see how a game on that can be interesting. On the other hand, I can see how right now, if you portray the colonialism in 19th century colonialism in Africa without thinking about the consequences, or at least modeling these consequences, I can see how this game is flawed right now. So both approaches, I would say it's a very complex debate that we have to have. And right now, at least in board games, is something that is not often seen. Then another limitation I see is this idea of the outdated narratives. And the reason behind that is that, and this is, let's say, it's something that can be criticized because it's kind of, I would not say elitist, but what I mean here is that most designers of games are not scholars. And while they may read a lot about these periods, and for some things they know way more than scholars about that, the issue here is that they do not have access to recent academic works, they do not have access to papers. And if that's the case, then they will read books that are outdated and visions that are probably not the most current ones. And as a consequence, games will perpetuate these visions. And that is a problem when you see games repeating or making, forcing you to make things that are clearly not correct based on what we know right now, because it's probably something that was correct, or at least was the most popular interpretation 20 years ago, but not right now. Okay, I'm showing here SPQR, apart from the fact that I really like this game, because it kind of perpetuates this idea that the Roman legions are let's say the way they move and the way they fight is and the type of maneuvers you can do with them compared to the other troops is this idea that is mostly created by Roman authors or Roman sources about how these legions, particularly with Scipio, are amazing, and they were so well trained that they can turn 90 degrees and do this and do that. So that is an issue because we know that that's not the case. And we know that, for example, the control that Hannibal could have in his troops was way less relevant than the one that all the sources provide. So from this perspective, while I can enjoy the game, at the same time, I see how if someone learns about the Roman tactics from this game, they will have an outdated learning here. And as a consequence, these kind of narratives will repeat themselves because even if they are not being used by scholars anymore, they are being portrayed in games, okay? I would say that that has a very simple solution, which is that academic works are open so everybody can read them if they're interested. And I'm pretty sure that lots of designers would love to have better grasp of all this literature that is not so often shared with game designers. And the last issue I see is this idea of the biased grand narratives. And I really like playing North Africa, but the question is how many games do you need portraying the Crusader operation? How many games do you need of the Normandy landings? How many games do you need of the Battle of the Bulge? Because they are topics that have been so covered by games that if someone learns about history from games, they will have a heavily biased narrative of the most important moments of history. You have seen this temporal coverage I have shown before, where most of history do not exist for war games, okay, at least for Europe. Even if you focus on World War I, World War II, some specific battles are the protagonist of a large percentage of games, okay? And this is hard to understand why, because I mean designers choose themes based on what they want, and at least in commercial war games, I don't think it's mostly about getting rich. I don't think that nobody's getting super rich selling war games. However, they are popular, so I understand how Battle of the Bulge game will sell more than a game about, I don't know, Battle of the Ebro in the Spanish Civil War. Okay, so that's something that I think it's important to understand, and hopefully, or I think that things are slowly changing, and they are changing because of the dynamics of the industry of board games. this is an example for a colleague of mine. So he's also from Barcelona, and he has just published a game about Ambon, which is like a very unknown battle. It's so unknown that nobody has ever done a war game on this battle. It's just a Japanese landing attack to a small island with a bunch of, if I'm not mistaken, Dutch and Australian troops. So why is this possible? Because the price to publish a war game right now is much, much smaller than what it was before. And you have an increasing number of game publishing companies publishing very small games at a very low price. So this is very interesting because it means that lots of people can create games on topics that are unknown, but maybe they are interested in this for very random reasons. It could be because the battle was near their home. Maybe they live in the battlefield. It could be just because it's someone from not UK, not the United States, and they feel that there is some topics of their military history that is worth exploring. I'm thinking here about all the Latin American conflicts that are seldom seen in war games. Someone from these countries that they understand or are very interested in one battle, they can actually produce and publish a game on that. That was not possible 20, 40 years ago. So that's something that probably, I hope, will change this biased narrative. And the actual trend is that the diversity of war games is increasing over time. So I hope that this can give you a more plural, or at least more diverse perspective on past conflict, and can allow you to, let's say, play any game of any conflict you're interested, or at least that could be one interesting objective, beyond the fact that obviously you will always have games about Normandy or Waterloo or the Battle of Britain. So to conclude, my feeling is that if we understand games as models, we will be better at understanding the games, but also we will be able to use this game in a much more powerful way to improve our understanding of the past and the present. And from this perspective, historical wargaming is an amazing resource in the sense that even if not everything is well represented, you have a vast diversity of topics to explore and a vast diversity of choices made by the designers. Like the last days, I have been skimming through different rules of Napoleonic tactic games. And you have such interesting difference there where, for example, some authors are giving a lot of importance to cavalry charges. Some other ones will prioritize the fatigue. Some other ones ignore fatigue. Fatigue is not one. It's not a mechanic in their games, and then they emphasize about disorder. So all this richness of game designs, in the end, it's just different portrayals of the same event. And as a consequence, by exploring that, by understanding what are the differences and how do they relate to what we know about this battlefield, that's something that can be quite interesting. And in the end, the idea here is that every, let's say, our society is using more and more games for different things, to enjoy, to learn, to entertain, to reflect, to be reflective about the past. So the idea here is what type of games should we be creating, and how can we use them to actually better understand the past, and as a consequence, try to somehow understand the present and the future. Thank you very much, and I would be very happy to answer any questions you have from the talk. Okay, I have a question. What background, education, interest lead you to examining this topic? My background is very weird because by training, I'm a computer scientist, and then I did a PhD in heritage studies. So here I combine the idea that I create models of the past using my background of past conflict with my hobbies of playing war games, and this idea that based on that, I think I'm able to dissect a game because I have experience modeling and understand the game as a model, and as a consequence, try to analyze better or enjoy better the decisions of the designer, if that makes sense. What is the button in the lower right of his slide? About slide 5. Let me go to slide 5. Oops. This one. Wait, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, I think it's this one. The one in the lower right here, this is Liberty Roads, which is this game on the Battle of Normandy. Well, it's a whole campaign of France, but here what you are seeing is the initial landings. Okay, so if nobody has more questions, thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoyed the talk, and it gave you some food for thought about how to approach wargames. And in any case, you have my contact details here at the end, so I will be very happy to answer any other questions you may have or doubts if you send me an email or contact me on Twitter. So thank you.